Hello, my name is Marion Grant. I would like to share the project-based STEM Lesson 7 of 12 of an 8th grade unit on Tennessee homelessness and establishing communities for the homeless. Prior to Lesson 7, students will have explored the homeless problem nationwide and narrowed down to the homeless in the state of Tennessee. Then students will have explored and analyzed homeless communities that have already been established throughout the United States and Tennessee, specifically Nashville. Students would be grouped based on learning profile cards, interests, and talents. Students will remain within these design groups for the duration of the unit unless the teacher has different suggestions otherwise. Also, prior to Lesson 7, students will have collaborated to design local communities for homelessness with policies, regulations, community requirements, basic needs, power and water supply, food supply, such as gardens, greenhouses, etc., how we're going to provide food for the homeless that are living there, housing and other community establishments, and the application process. Lesson 7 is the tiny house design segment and will take 4 block class periods to complete. Upon completion of this lesson, students will associate the basic requirements for living space. For one only needs a small space to be a comfortable, safe place to call home. The smaller, more efficient the house is, the less expense is required to maintain it. After investigating the causes of homelessness, types of people who are homeless, including percentage of each classified, and researching newly established homeless communities and how they were funded and formulated, students will examine basic needs, cost efficiency, and space required for tiny houses to accommodate the classified types of homeless people in Tennessee, and design floor plans for the tiny houses, and using area, perimeter, and geometry skills, construct models of each, including interior design and energy type, to be placed within the homeless community blueprint plans each design committee has formulated. The ultimate goal is for students to create models of the tiny homes with precise measurements and efficient utilization of space. This STEAM lesson lattices ELA, math, science, engineering, and art Tennessee standards, which are listed on the lesson plan provided. The lesson objectives for the entire lesson, which is in 3 parts, are as follows. Within designed groups, students will collaborate and list interior needs for a tiny house based on the assigned homeless classification, whether it be a war veteran, chronically homeless individual, male, female, single mother with 1 child, and single mother with up to 3 children. Students will discuss and distinguish basic needs of each represented homeless group to determine types of tiny houses to design to meet basic efficient needs of each. Students will use Google Document to produce a table charting the interior necessities of each homeless group. Students will use internet resources to investigate and compare material costs for interior instruction of framing, the roof, windows, doors, etc., and interior design of ceiling, walls, floor lighting, etc., to select the materials and estimate most cost efficiency. Students will compose a cost proposal for the exterior building and interior design, which includes complete price list of materials and total cost of a 300 square foot and a 400 square foot tiny house. Students will then determine if the houses can be smaller or if 300 and 400 square foot for tiny houses are most efficient. The students will use online planning apps such as Room Styler or 3D Planner or Havertys.com furniture room planner to design the floor plans for each of the 3 tiny houses represented, which includes 1 window, 1 door, lighting, flooring, basic appliance needs, furniture, etc. Students will use internet resources to investigate and compare material costs for selected interior necessities to produce a receipt with the least expense cost possible while maintaining an acceptable level of quality built to last. Students will use grid scale graphing paper to create a visual art detailed drawing of each tiny house design, or the students may use Google SketchUp.com or any 3D design software for this task. I think giving the students the choice matters, because we may have students that feel more comfortable hand drawing it, and then you have students who would welcome the challenge of using the Google SketchUp or 3D design software to create this. Collaboratively, the design groups will generate a list of supplies needed to construct a model replica for each tiny house. Each member is responsible for bringing assigned supplies other than the basic art supplies that the teacher would provide in the classroom. If there's anything special that they want to use, they will have to decide who is able to bring those, who will take the responsibilities of that. Design groups will construct model replicas of the tiny houses they designed using floor plans and proposal lists and decided items. A rubric will be provided for evaluating projects, and also checklisting to see if they have met the requirements. That is also included in the lesson plan. Design groups will formulate a 5 to 7 minute presentation explaining their tiny house projects and formally present to class audience. The rigor relevance framework will be applicable for this lesson, which includes acquisition, application, assimilation, and adaptation. So the acquisition, students gather and store bits of knowledge and information and are primarily expected to remember or understand this knowledge. The application process, students use acquired knowledge to solve problems, design solutions, and complete work. The highest level of application is to apply knowledge to new and unpredictable situations, which this lesson meets that criteria. And then assimilation, students extend and refine their acquired knowledge to be able to use that knowledge automatically and routinely to analyze and solve problems and create solutions. And adaptation, students have the competence to think in complex ways to complete this lesson invention. The formative assessment would be based upon analyzing student work as they progress throughout the lesson project, observing 1-minute writes, epiphany checklist of checkpoints with exit tickets, think, pair, and share observations, strategic questioning, graffiti art response observations, rubric grading for lesson project, and presentation evaluation. Now, the hook activity to initiate interest and curiosity in part 1 would be prior to the lesson. As part of the introduction hook, each student would be commissioned to decide which room in his or her house is his or her favorite, measure and record the dimensions, and in 1 paragraph explain why the room is his or her favorite room and submit that to the Google Classroom. And then the next day in class, we would start out with I've Got Your Back discussion engagement activity. And students wander around the classroom while music is playing, and I chose Another Day in Paradise because it talks about homelessness by Phil Collins. When the music stops, students quickly find a partner to stand quietly back to back and wait for instruction. Teacher instructs when students hear the drum beat, they are to share favorite room and why, and dimensions with the partner. And then this is repeated with 1 or 2 more wander arounds. The next round, change instruction to the following question. What would life be like for you if this room was the only living quarters you had. So students would have to think about that. If this was the only room that they had to live within for the rest of their lives. And then how would the thought process change? Would it still be their favorite room? And what would life be like for a homeless person in their favorite room? And then students would call out different perspectives and listen to common threads once this process is done. Then students will gather in their assigned design groups, and the project will be introduced by showing a tiny house video, and the title of that video is 13-Year-Old Boy Builds Tiny House Under $1,500. After a 1-minute write, students will discuss the video and agree on 2 things that stand out to them and 1 question they have about it. Groups share out, and then the teacher scribes questions to revisit at the closure of the lesson. The essential questions for the entire lesson are as follows. What would be some possible effects if each state funded its highest homeless populated area with aid to build a community with tiny houses for the homeless? What criteria would you use to develop and design a tiny house for the homeless? How would you modify a standard size residential house that has 1,250 square feet into a tiny house with just 300 to 400 square feet? What would you need to consider eliminating? And they would have to explain this. What are the advantages and disadvantages of living in a tiny house? What best resources could you use to investigate and compare material costs for building a tiny house? How will you compile the information your group finds? What math skills will your group use for these tasks and why? How will you develop a cost proposal for your bids on the tiny houses? What should be considered in the proposal? What revisions to the dimensions or needs would you make after evaluating and estimating cost, expense, why or why not? What materials did your design team decide to use to construct models to the tiny houses? Who will be responsible for bringing supplies? What supplies are readily present within the classroom? And the second part of part 1 activity will be a graffiti art response activity. This independent activity involves movement, critical and logical thinking, and writing. The teacher instructs students to silently gallery walk around to each poster displaying questions when the music starts. Students are given poster markers to write responses to the questions anywhere on the poster and initial each response. The responses can be in the form of a quick sketch, a phrase, a sentence, and extensions from another student's response. They must travel to each poster and leave their marking responses to each question. The teacher can control the time spent at each poster by using a migrating signal, whether that is to stop the music after a allotted time and start back after students migrate to another poster, or using another instrument such as a drum, which is what I usually use. And then I also use soft music, so it stimulates the brain and thought process. So I use a coffee house playlist. After each poster is adorned with graffiti response art, they will be spotlighted and have volunteers to share out what they noticed. And then, of course, conduct a quick whole group discussion using accountable talk. And then next, the first step collaborative planning session. Students are instructed to gather back into assigned design teams to engage in the first collaborative task. Within assigned design groups, students will collaborate and list the interior needs for a tiny house based on the assigned homeless classification that they were received. Students will discuss and distinguish basic needs of each represented homeless groups to determine types of tiny houses to design to meet basic efficient needs of each. And then they will use a Google document to produce the table charting the interior necessities for each homeless group. Now for a closure epiphany checkpoint, students will engage in a live Google Classroom Epiphany Tree Forum to share 2 positive things they learned from lesson part 1. And then students' responses must be no less than 100 words and must be initialed. Part 2, which would be the next day, students will begin with revisiting the Epiphany Tree Forum and write a response to 2 members of the fellow design groups. The responses must be no less than 75 words each. They need to make sure each group has computers and iPad devices to search for resources. Each group's leader should also make sure responsibilities are clarified for each member according to the rubric. And then the lesson for the day, in their collaborative groups, the students will use the internet resources to investigate and compare material costs for exterior construction and interior necessities as well. And then they will select the materials and estimate most efficient cost. They will then compose a proposal for the cost of the 300 square foot or 400 square foot tiny house. And then they will determine if they can downsize or if the 300 and 400 would be most efficient for their assigned homeless group. Students will then analyze sample tiny house model plans to inspire designs. And then they will use a 3D planner to design the floor plans for each of the 3 tiny houses represented, which again includes 1 window, 1 door, lighting, flooring, basic appliance needs, furniture, etc. Students will use internet resources to investigate and compare material cost for the selected interior necessities to produce a receipt with the least amount of cost while maintaining acceptable levels of quality built to last. Then, of course, they will use the grid scale. This is where they will create the visual art design blueprint for their tiny house. And they may use the scale grid graphic paper or Google SketchUp in 3D. It's their choice within their groups. Then they will collaborate to generate a list of supplies needed to actually create the replica for the next lesson. Then their Epiphany checkpoint, they will answer the following questions in the Epiphany Tree Forum. What math skills did you use to complete the task for part 2 of the lesson design? And how are these math skills important to the success of this project? And then again, each response should be no less than 100 words and must be initialed. Students are responsible for bringing materials to the lesson 3 project the next day. And then, of course, the teacher can assess and provide some of the basic necessities as well for their tiny replicas. Part 3 of the design collaboration. Students' design teams will divvy responsibilities to utilize time allotted. Students will have the block class period of 90 minutes to construct the models. Any minor details unfinished must be completed by team members at home and added during session 4. Design groups will construct the model replicas of the tiny houses they design using the floor plans and proposal lists and decided items. A rubric will be provided for evaluating the projects. The teacher is to facilitate by assisting with additional material needs and maintaining order in the task performance. This is a student-centered, student-led, and student-owned lesson here. The Epiphany checkpoint will use the 2 high-order questions on the Epiphany exit ticket. Students must respond to each with no less than 75 words. So the questions that were generated at the beginning they will choose two of those to answers, because by now they should be able to answer those questions that they came up with at the beginning of lesson 1 or session 1. So part 4 is the presentation collaboration. Design groups will have 30 minutes to formulate a 5-minute presentation focused around the following question: what makes your project tiny house for the homeless unique? Design groups will formulate a 5-minute presentation explaining the design process of their tiny house projects and formally present to the class audience. Each group member must participate in the presentation. Information must be constructed on Google Slides or PowerPoint. These slides serve as note cards, and then the teacher will allow each design group only 5 minutes. They must use at least 4 minutes and no more than 5. And the teacher will provide students with a copy of the presentation rubric so they know what qualities they must exhibit during the presentation. And that presentation rubric is also in the lesson plan. Okay. Then, prior to the session 4, the teacher will take the class-generated questions formulated during session 1 and display them on poster paper or whiteboards around the room. At the close of the project lesson, students will revisit and reflect upon their generated questions about tiny houses for the homeless as the teacher conducts a final graffiti art gallery walk with music. Once students have responded to each question and initialed responses, the teacher will ask for volunteers to share out connected significant responses. The homework final epiphany reflection, students will use the project reflection questionnaire, which is also included in the lesson plan, to complete a self-evaluation and project reflection. This will be due the following class day, but also will be submitted to Google Classroom. Thank you for watching this video presentation. Your feedback is greatly valued and appreciated.